Hello, everybody. We have Chris Richardson here. He is one of the co-founders of Argo. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself briefly to the audience?
Sure. My name is Chris Richardson. I am the General Counsel COO of BDV Solutions and Argo. And before I was here, I was over at a law firm, immigration law firm. But before that, I was a visa officer overseas. I served in Nigeria, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Spain doing visa interviews for the US government.
And how many years did you work for the U.S. government?
It was about 8 years with the State Department.
Oh, wow. And so during that time, what kind of roles do you have? What does it really mean to be a visa officer? How do you end up in that job?
Sure. So when you join the State Department, you're actually joining as a diplomat. And so you, as a diplomat, you can do four or five different types of jobs. You can do a job in economics, a job in political, a job in management, managing the embassy, a job in public diplomacy, which is going out and talking about America or press relations. And there's also something called a consular officer. And that's what I did. I was a consular officer. And as consular officers, you are in charge of visas and American citizens abroad. So I did a little bit of roles in helping American citizens abroad, but also in adjudicating visa applications from people who are applying at the embassy and trying to get a visa to come to the United States, whether to live or work.
Awesome. So how do you even join the State Department? What is that process like?
So, for everyone it's different, but usually what you do is you take the what's called the Foreign Service exam, and that exam consists of lots of questions about the economy, lots of questions about world history, lots of questions about current conditions, current political conditions, economic conditions. So you take like a written exam, and if you pass the written exam, then you do an oral exam, which is an all-day exam. They put you in a room, and they basically question you and ask you to rate projects. And if you pass all that, you have to get through medical clearance and then security clearance. And then if you pass all that, you become a foreign service officer, you become a diplomat. It's a very rigorous process. In many ways, you have to be lucky to even get through it all. I think only 5% of applicants actually get through the process from start to finish. So it's a very rigorous thing to do, but I wouldn't have traded it for anything else in the world.
Wow. No, that sounds pretty intense. So visa officers are not just people that are signing up to go work abroad. They really are dedicated to wanting to work for the U.S. government, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. People had to work really hard to get this. And once you're there, you really have to focus on representing our country and doing that in a holistic way, because it can be a really hard job working in these different countries. But you really have to think about what's the greater good for the country, even when you do a visa interview.
Makes sense. And like you were saying, there's a number of different roles within the consular process, but one of those is a visa officer, which is what we deal directly
hmm
here with at Argo. As a visa officer, what does a typical day look like for a visa officer working for the State Department?
Oh, there is no typical day, but when you are a visa officer, it really depends on the size of the post. But I can say that you'll wake up probably fairly early. Usually, most embassies start interviewing about 8:30, but you need to probably get there, depending on the country, a little bit earlier. So, if you are doing immigrant visas or non-immigrant visas, but most of the time you're probably starting off doing non-immigrant visas, which are your tourist visas, your student visas. And so basically, you're going to be behind a glass window. You're going to have the staff that's maybe doing the fingerprints, but chances are you might actually have to do the fingerprints yourself. It'll be this glass window. You're going to have a computer, and you're basically going to need to interview maybe 120 applicants per hour. That really boils
Wow.
down to maybe a 2 or 3 minute, you know, 2, 3, 4 minute interview with each person for these tourist and student visas.
It seems like there's a misconception about visa officers being mean or angry, but it seems more like maybe they just have a lot of pressure on them to do a lot in a
Mhm.
small amount of time.
Right. And I think that, when I was a visa officer, my philosophy was is that every individual was going to get their private interview. But I have to do that within the confines of I don't have a lot of time, right? Like normally, you have like 10, 15 million people who apply for visas or want to have visas to travel to the United States, but only a finite number of visa officers. And so as officers, you're really expected to do 120, 130 interviews per hour. And the law is written in a way that they want you to make those quick snap judgments. And the law is written in a way to say that, hey, you know what, you're kind of guilty until proven innocent. You need to prove to me that you meet the requirements to come to the United States. It's not the other way around. And so I think that because there's this misconception among visa applicants as to what their rights are or what the role of the officer is, they really think they're going to go and get this long-winded interview when in fact, for the most part, you're not going to get that because the officers just don't have time.
Makes sense. And you're mentioning like what the law is, all those things, and you have the perspective of being an immigration attorney as well. How do you feel like a visa officer's decision-making process differs from like an attorney's decision-making process?
So an attorney has lots of time. You have a lot of time to read over the paperwork. You have a lot of time to analyze the situation, and you might be very much based on the paperwork. You might not even listen to the applicant, but you really want to look at the paperwork. Visa officers don't have time to look at paperwork. They really have to make these judgments based on what the applicant is saying. So, having been both an immigration attorney and a visa officer, I see this distinction all the time. Immigration attorneys are going to read all this information and basically read the case to death. Officers don't have time for that. They really want to talk to the applicant, and they want the applicant. Not do they want. It's the obligation of the applicant to explain why they're traveling to the United States and why that officer should not refuse them.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. So now that you're on the other side of working for the State Department, what kind of led you to wanting to create Argo?
I did tens of thousands of interviews overseas. And what I found was that a lot of applicants were just really unprepared. They didn't understand, what goes into a visa interview. They relied heavily on documents, and they just weren't ready. In the State Department, as it grows, that we have so many visa applicants, really doesn't have time to sit there and explain to applicants why they're not qualified. And so I really noticed that there was this breach between applicant expectations and reality. And I thought that Argo, or having consular officers give this kind of advice, really filled that breach, fill that void in a way that was beneficial to both the applicants and to the U.S. government, because I don't think that the U.S. government has the time to explain to people, what their issues are. But we as Argos can explain that in a way that the U.S. government simply can't. And so I don't look at us as, competition with anybody. I look at us as complementary of everybody. We help the visa applicants. We help the U.S. government. We help immigration attorneys. We help simplify something that's really complex in a way that's beneficial and understood for these visa applicants before they go to that interview and get denied.
That makes sense. And especially what you're saying, that Argo is really something completely new. They're not filling out your forms. It's not doing what an attorney would do. It's a new concept or service that you could get in this visa process.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you feel like during your time as a visa officer was the biggest misconception you saw people have about their impending interview?
Oh, that the paperwork mattered, that the paperwork was the key, that if I could read my way to a visa, and that's not going to happen, right? Like you can sit there and read all the paper and shove all the paperwork you want in front of an officer. If anything, that just frustrates the officer more. And so I think that my biggest fear or my biggest thing about that was just seeing so many people get bad advice and go in there thinking that if I just give them this document, that's what makes me qualified for the visa. No, you really have to explain what are your qualifications to the officer and demonstrate your qualifications to the officer by word. You can't just rely simply on putting it on a paper and assuming that I'm going to read and trust that paper.
Makes sense. And what you're saying about like the documents and the interview and the actual talking part of it, that seems to be a distinction between the US process and other countries. Like, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, like in the UK, for example, in the Schengen countries, they really are heavily reliant on documents. Documents and paperwork really, really matter to them. But even in the US government, with visas, that are being adjudicated here in the country, such as adjustment of status, that is very paperwork intensive. So, even parts of the US government are paperwork intensive. This just isn't one of them. And so, a lot of people, for example, when I was in Spain or in Nigeria, when they apply to other countries, the documents really mattered. For the U.S. government, it simply doesn't.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think people might have that misconception if they've maybe done a visa interview for another country and then they come to the US visa interview and they're a little bit
Right.
confused or lost on
Exactly
what
right.
went wrong.
Exactly right. 100% right. And I think that is where a lot of the confusion lies, is that people just don't realize that you don't need to be focused so much on what does my document say. More important is what you are saying, and advocating for your own case.
That makes sense. So if you met someone tomorrow walking down the street, well, you were in another country and they said that they had their visa interview tomorrow, what would you tell them before as your last good luck wish?
I would tell them to be honest with themselves, to really be thoughtful and circumspect in if they're qualified or not for this visa. A lot of people apply for this visa who aren't qualified. They're not qualified and they're going to get denied or refused. And there are no tricks, no magic, no amount of preparation that's going to allow you necessarily if you truly are not qualified. But if you are qualified and you have the means and you've traveled before, and I would tell you, call a company like Argo, them help you navigate, or they'll help you navigate the immigration system, figure out what is the key points of that visa interview, and really understand what are the important things that need to come out when I do my talk to the visa officer. And so I think that that's the important thing that you need to think about before your visa interview.
That makes sense. And to kind of bring this back to something Chris was saying earlier, is that you have a very short time to actually speak to the visa officer. So you have to make sure that you're using that time as efficiently
Wisely.
as possible. Yeah,
Exactly
wisely.
right. Exactly right.
So it seems it is a difficult task ahead of people.
Okay,
Okay,
right.
so we're about to wind down, Chris. Thanks for the time. But if you could tell something that visa applicants should know about a visa officer, since you have adjudicated thousands of visas, what do you think a visa applicant should know about who visa officers really are?
I think the most important thing that they need to know about visa officers is that they're human. They're just like everybody else. They have time pressures, they have time crunches, and that they're doing the best that they can. And that while they may seem distant and remote, they are actually people who are residing in that country and just trying to make it day to day, in a system that doesn't always benefit them, in a system that puts a lot of pressure on them and demands a lot of them, while living very far away from their homes.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Chris, for the time. Appreciate you being here and hope that people enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better and getting to learn a little bit more about the visa process.
Happy to be here.